College and this evening's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum, a student production. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is your moderator, Tony Stewart, welcoming you once again to the North Idaho College Public Forum. On behalf of the panel, it is my great pleasure to welcome to our program a guest from back east who is one of the most well-known persons in the field of theology. Our guest is Dr. Joseph Fletcher. Dr. Fletcher formerly was a Robert Treat Payne Professor of Social Ethics in the Episcopal Theological School at Cambridge, Massachusetts. Dr. Fletcher has had wide social experiences in such areas as a coal miner, an auditor assistant, a rope factory worker, a resident worker in a New York settlement house, and a social research worker. He has preached or lectured in more than 30 universities throughout the world. He is a former president and now director of the Association of Voluntary Sterilization and of the American Society for Christian Ethics. He is now vice president of the Association for the Study of Abortion and a director of the Euthanasia Society of America. He currently is serving as a professor of biomedical ethics at the University of Virginia. Dr. Fletcher, it's a pleasure having you on our program.
Thank you, sir.
I also welcome to our panel today three members. To my far left is John Larson, who was educated at the University of Florida, at SMU, and at Yale. He is presently pastor of St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Welcome to the program. Next to Father Larson is Mr. Richard Snyder, who received his master's degree in anthropology at UCLA in Los Angeles. He is presently a member of the faculty teaching anthropology at North Idaho College. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tony.
Our third panel member to my immediate left is Mr. Pete Simmons, who has a bachelor's degree in business administration from San Diego State and is now a business executive in the state of Idaho. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tony.
We'll proceed to questions at once, and the first question today from Father Larson.
Dr. Fletcher, a few weeks ago you were at North Idaho College for their Convocation Week, in which you dealt with the field of biomedical ethics, focusing in on some of the things that are now happening in the field of human reproduction and the ethical implications of this. And I think since some of the questions will be pointed in this direction, it might be helpful to take some time to inform our viewing audience of some of the things that are happening now.
Right. I think we're all used to the idea of political revolutions and social revolutions, but I think now we're having a biological revolution too, and we ought to be maybe a little better informed about it than just one area, for example, to illustrate how revolutionary things are getting to be in modern biology and medicine. Look at human reproduction. For centuries, of course, we've known one way to bring new people into the world, one way to make babies, and that was by the familiar method that brought us all into the world. But now we find that modern medicine makes it possible to borrow seed from another man if the husband can't supply it for any reason, or to borrow eggs from another person if the wife is unable for whatever reason, medical or another kind, to provide the necessary ova. It is possible now to remove a patient's eggs and tinker with it, or it's possible to fertilize her ovum artificially by a laboratory procedure and then implant that artificially fertilized egg in her uterus for the normal and usual development. It is possible to bring a baby into this world by having somebody else do it for us, so-called surrogate or hostess gestation, letting somebody else do the job for you if you are unable, either for reasons of health or maybe of vocation. You couldn't stop what you were doing in order to make your own baby. It's possible now to as soon as we finish the job of synthesizing placenta, to make a baby from beginning to end of the process in an artificial container. If it were done, for example, one of these days with an artificial placenta in a glass container, we could all monitor the development of a baby from the very beginning right up to birth itself, and learn an enormous amount to help us save many babies which are lost through congenital defects that we don't understand anything about yet. It's possible also to bring babies into the world now with only one parent by putting a body cell, a somatic cell from any part of the human being's body into an egg, and then implanting that egg for development in the human womb, so that the child which results from it is, so to speak, an identical twin with the single parent, man or woman. And it is also possible, or will be shortly, it's already being done with lower orders of animals, to start female egg developing without any sexual union with a male sperm whatsoever. It's a process called parthenogenesis, and it would mean, for example, that radical women's lib types would be able to look forward to a future of plenty of human beings without any male participation whatsoever. Well, these are just rather oversimplified. I don't mean to be silly or foolish about them, but these are some of the things that really are actually happening. It's a real revolution.
I think one of the questions in the mind of a lot of people that are beginning to be aware that we are able to do these things in human reproduction is, who's going to call the shots? Who's going to be in control of this kind of medical technology almost? Is the individual man or woman, or the married couple, or will it be some kind of medical board or society, or will some political decision be made? In other words, will the state ultimately stick its hand in and make the decision as to what will be done with this kind of data?
Well, you're asking not an ethical question, ought these things to be done, but the political question, who is to authorize them and control their employment. And I, as one individual, sort of think that ideally they should be employed when the individuals involved, the parents or prospective parents, decide they should be used. But it's entirely possible in the future, as we learn more about these things and have more experience with their use, that some social attitudes will develop also about limiting principles and controlling principles. I would hope that politicians don't determine what they are, but rather that responsible agencies of the public authority, like, for example, the National Institutes of Health in Washington at Bethesda, Maryland, might do some of that kind of thing. But the best government is the least government in my philosophy, and the best control is the least control in my philosophy.
Mr. Snyder.
Dr. Fletcher, I think it's one thing to have genetic engineering capabilities, that is, to have an intellectual grasp on these concepts, but it's been my experience that people are primarily motivated by emotions and not intellectually. And certainly genetic tinkering, I think the term was he used,
yes,
is an emotionally loaded subject.
Right.
And how do we motivate people to take advantage of this genetic engineering?
Well, I think there may be all kinds of habitual sentiments and attitudes which would hesitate to do these apparently artificial, maybe even arguably inhuman things. The best way we can remotivate people, that is to say, move them to employ some of the new means of reproduction, I think will be by showing them how much the babies they bring into the world would benefit from the use of these procedures. Until they do see some practical, good, pragmatic reason, some benefit to be gained from using these unaccustomed things, they're not apt to want to use them.
Mr. Simmons.
Dr. Fletcher, how wide spread is the acceptance from the medical community of the concept of genetic control or artificial reproduction?
I think that the principle of genetic control is quite widely accepted in the medical community. With regard to specific new artificial methods of reproduction, which are based in large part, but not solely, on a knowledge of genetics, I think you get quite a variation of sentiment and feeling about them among physicians, just as you do in the general public.
You pointed out in your talk this morning an incident that occurred in New York Hospital that involved two doctors. Do you feel that the action taken by the, I believe it was the head of the hospital, in destroying the experiment or by the doctor was based on a medical belief or a religious belief?
The doctor who brought that procedure to a stop, it was an attempt to artificially fertilize an ovum for a couple who were suffering from an infection of the wife's fallopian tubes, which made it impossible for them to conceive in the normal way. Did so, he interfered with it and brought it to a stop because he was the chief of the service and, so to speak, the authority in control. And he brought it to a stop because he thought it was wrong. And you're asking me to speculate, did he think it was wrong for reasons of medicine or reasons of religion? I don't know whether that particular doctor is consciously religiously oriented or not. I have an idea that he may have a feeling or an attitude which is in large part attributable to religious influences, if not in his past, in our past as a people, namely the feeling that such devices are artificial, and being artificial, they are unnatural, and being unnatural, they're wrong. My own feeling about that problem is that the mere fact that something is unnatural doesn't mean that it's evil, and that very often what we naturally want is achieved better by artificial means than by natural means.
Dr. Fletcher, before we get into, I assume, some rather thorough questions on the theological implications of all of this and social ethics that you're so involved in, may I ask one question that deals with, again, the medical aspect, and that is, you have certainly laid out for us here, I think, a quite clear picture of the medical technology is here. They are doing these things. What is going to be the result of that medically? What kind of offspring is it going to produce? I'm speaking of the quality of the human race and hereditary characteristics. I'm also alluding to the deficient genes that we understand we all have some of. Is this going to produce a different kind of human being as from the medical viewpoint?
Well, I think that modern genetics is helping us to determine, before a baby is conceived, that some persons at reproductive age are carrying very serious bad genes which transmit serious diseases to their children. And therefore, by applying this knowledge in a quite practical fashion, physicians are often able to tell parents that they had better not have children in the normal, ordinary, typical fashion, because the children born that way would be, as it were, victimized, now knowingly. You see, what's making it a real headache for us all is that modern medicine and medical science is beginning to show us how we could, if we would, exert quality controls over our reproduction of which we hadn't even the faintest suspicion one generation ago. Now, this is in one sense a great medical success, but it is also enormously increasing the problems of decision making, which we have to do now and which we didn't used to have to do in the past.
Father Larson. I want to ask a question that really doesn't state my own position, but one I'm sure would be very much popular in this area. A lot of people would raise the question as to the Bible's position that man is supposed to be fruitful and multiply the earth, and that all of this involvement in technology concerning human reproduction is somehow antithetical to God's will, and especially as it's set forth in Scripture. And how would you respond to these types of questions, these types of people?
Well, I'd say that in the ancient days, when that portion of the Bible was written, it was obvious that the world needed more people so that men might subdue it and till it. Now that situation has changed, and we've reached a point in our modern urban industrial society and culture in which we're faced with the opposite problem, not of underpopulation, but of overpopulation. And it is a part of our human stewardship under God to make the most constructive and sensible and proportionate judgments about these things we can.
I heard you also at North Idaho College say that we ought to be as concerned about quality control as about quantity control.
Quite so. Planned Parenthood, in a way, is concerned with quantity control, and that's very important. But we ought not only to make sure that we don't have more children than we should, but also make sure that we don't have any more inferior children than we need to have.
Mr. Snyder.
Thank you. Pardon me. It would seem to me, Dr. Fletcher, that with the artificial and semi-artificial means of baby making that you've described, and the frequency with which abortions are being performed, and the development of heart transplants, it would seem to me that about this time, we as human beings should take a look at redefining what life is. In other words, what is our definition of life? In the case of an unborn child, at what point is it legally a live human being, and therefore we're not allowed to tamper with it? Should you agree that it needs redefining? I'm not going to ask you to redefine life, but along what lines of thinking would you proceed?
Yes. This question is a very shrewd question, Mr. Snyder, because the question, when is an individual alive, really alive, is at stake in euthanasia, it's at stake in the abortion question, and so on. And the thrust of my own thinking, for whatever that's worth, at the moment is that it isn't life that's important. As long as cell division is going on, you've got life. And even after the heart ceases to beat, cell division continues for a considerable time. And it isn't just that, systemically speaking, organs function. To me, authentically, truly, genuinely human life in the sense of personhood is possible only when there is cerebral function, however minimal, some kind of capacity to think. And if you have an individual organism, no matter how lively it might be in terms of its biological functioning, in which there is no cerebral capacity, you have a living organism, but it is subhuman. And life in the sense of human authenticity hasn't begun until cerebral function begins, and that's after birth. And it has ceased to be when it has stopped. When you have, for example, a so-called vegetable in which cerebral function is lost irreversibly, irrecoverably, humanhood has gone. You have a body left, no matter how much it continues to function biologically, but you don't have a person.
May I interject one point here to a question, I should say, that Mr. Snyder brought up, and that is there not a distinction, however, between those two examples? That is, if the fetus is undisturbed, that the day will come in many cases when it would have that very active brain capacity, whereas in later life, because of accidents or disasters, it's ceased for good.
Correct. That's a very real difference. On the historical continuum, in the case of euthanasia, you have a patient who has had cerebral function and now it is gone. In the case of a fetus, you have an individual who hasn't yet had it but could potentially. Now, I think the point about determining whether or not any living organism, including a human fetus, is a person or not, is determining not whether it is potentially cerebral, but whether it is actually cerebral. And as long as a fetus is only potentially cerebral, that is simply another way of saying that it is not cerebral, and therefore it is not a person.
Since there is a great division in our society and all others over the question of abortion, and there has to be some resolution of this problem.
Quite so.
And although some take the position that to allow abortions, especially of a fetus that is healthy, is murder, and they are determined to push for laws that would so indicate this, and others are saying it must be an individual choice. How are we in the end going to resolve this conflict between these two thinking processes?
I think it's going to be resolved in our pluralistic democracy here in America by an eventual determination that those who regard abortion as murder, however sincerely, are a minority. Now, it's the business of a healthy democracy to respect the integrity of those with minority opinions. And the law of this land makes it quite clear that nobody is required against his conscience to have an abortion. Or her conscience, I perhaps should say. It also says, in democratic spirit, that nobody should rightly be compelled to carry a fetus to term. In other words, we don't want any compulsory pregnancy or compulsory motherhood. And this ethically is the basic question at stake in this lively debate at the present time. It is not the question whether abortion is justifiable or not. The real question is compulsory pregnancy justifiable? And I am positively and utterly convinced that it is utterly wrong to compel any woman to be pregnant against her will.
Mr. Stillman.
I'd like to get back to a comment you made this morning when you talked about the number of bad genes the average person has and how they multiply over a period of years.
8 to 10, they tell us, yes.
Yes. How common is it for people who have no knowledge of any particular problem that they have to be tested when it is discovered that the woman is pregnant? And is there any program that would educate or recommend educating people to testing before pregnancy to see if they had the bad gene problem?
Well, we're just on the frontier now of this kind of genetic counseling to parents or prospective parents, but we've crossed the frontier and we're on the way. I would say that by and large we haven't yet worked out any ways of successfully testing and warning people on any very big scale unless the disease is one which is rampant in a particular group, such as an ethnic group. Now, with regard to people of Mediterranean Jewish background, there is a very common genetic disorder called Tay-Sachs disease. That is so endemic and so widespread among Ashkenazic Jews that they quickly discover what their problem is, and they're coming now to medical counselors in droves to be tested and treated accordingly. Most, perhaps, of the other genetic disorders are quite sporadic and episodic, and it's very hard, unless we learn something about their medical history in a family, to have any reason to even suspect that they may have a problem.
Father Larson, I'd like to broaden up the discussion a little bit. You, in some ways, almost gained notoriety a few years ago dealing with the field of situation ethics, in which you made quite clear that the concrete situation radically conditions the way you deal with a particular problem or issue. And I would like to present one particular issue that is confronting the human community now, namely that of world hunger, in which we, to some degree, have a very knotty problem where there are some underdeveloped countries that have done very little in the way of attempting to control their population. And the data seems to indicate that to simply give food to those people rather than really providing a solution to hunger simply tends to make them strong enough to produce more people so that there are more hungry people. Now, my question is, do you think that it is ethically responsible or irresponsible to withhold feeding people who refuse to do anything to accept responsibility for the number of people they're producing?
If the data does satisfactorily establish that it makes things worse for them to give food to people who do not control their population, then I would say that it was immoral to give them the food, and therefore moral to withhold the food. Now, a friend of mine at the University of California in Santa Barbara has recently published a paper supporting the contention that if you love the people in Bangladesh or in some of the Sahel countries in sub-Sahara Africa, you ought not to feed them though they are starving to death, because if you do feed them, they will simply reproduce and you will have a net loss of human life as your result rather than a net gain. Now, I don't know whether his thesis is sound or not. He's a very reasonable and knowledgeable man, and when I first read his argument to that effect, I found that my viscera, my feelings, were set at war with my cerebrum, my mental processes. And I'm still looking for a good hole in that argument because I don't like it. But I'm quite clear that if, in the end, I have, no matter how unwillingly, to acknowledge that his case is a good one, I will have to draw the conclusion that it would be immoral to feed those people. And I must confess, though I have no expert knowledge of these matters, that at the present time I am very reluctantly being convinced that he is right.
Mr. Snyder.
If I may go back to baby making for a moment and the whole kind of governmental control over this kind of thing. Actually, it's not baby making, but you've mentioned that in our land we do not compel a woman to have an abortion, nor do we compel her to carry a fetus to full term. Would you restate what you've stated recently elsewhere about the case of thalassemia in Italy, and how the Italian government counsels and deals with thalassemia, and then how a similar kind of congenital disease might be handled, say, in Scandinavia?
Yes, that's a good question, because it illustrates our problem, the one that we're all worried about and concerned with. In Italy, there is a genetic disorder called thalassemia, which is very widespread in some provinces. The provincial governments there, therefore, require all candidates for a marriage license to be screen tested for this disease. It's a recessive disease, meaning that both the husband and the wife would have to be carriers of the disease in order for their children to have the disease. If the results of the test show that both the man and the woman applicants for a marriage license are carriers of the disease, they may, so far as the law is concerned, then go on anyway and marry and have as many children as they want, which seems to me insane. I mean, perfectly, utterly, ridiculously, irresponsibly inconsistent. Now, I would want to contrast favorably to the Italian picture at the moment, though it will probably be changed shortly, what goes on in Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Norway and Denmark, where the same kind of screen testing is required for a number of different genetic disorders, not including thalassemia. And if the tests are positive in that case, those people are required in one or both of the partners to the marriage to be sterilized, resorting then to to adoption, or one of these new modes of reproduction that I've been talking about, rather than to victimize innocent little babies who, would become the victims of their reproduction. And I would say that the Scandinavian example is humane and loving and responsible, and that the Italian scene is irresponsible and unloving and most unjust.
Mr. Sinlin.
Once again, to broaden the discussion, I recently read an article you wrote on the shameful waste of tissue, in which you were decrying the shortage, or at least the failure on people to come forward and donate tissues for living people, and for living people to donate those tissues, in which you said that as people have a tendency to have serious doubts about life after death, it's actually benefiting the living because they are more apt to make that donation. Is this an indication of doubt on your part, or are you merely indicating that people's failure to understand life after death is making them more generous to the living?
Well, I'm not quite sure that I understand the thrust of your question. Put it to me slightly differently now. Let me see if I...
Basically, you indicated that people today have some doubt about life after death. Basically, I'm asking you if you do also have the same doubt.
Oh, I see. Yes. I think that, like most of my contemporaries, I have some doubt in my own mind about eternal life understood as personal survival after death. By its very nature, it's not anything that I could be dogmatic about, deny or affirm. Theologically, my personal beliefs or feelings about eternal life might be put something like this, that I haven't the faintest idea whether I, Joseph Fletcher, will exist in another world. I am convinced that Almighty God is the sovereign Lord of all worlds, And whatever arrangement he has made about it is perfectly okay with me, whether I'm extinguished or survive in either case. It's up to him anyway, obviously. I'm not going to determine it. So I don't need any faith in the matter. I just need faith in God.
I would like to pursue with you, Dr. Fletcher, a question as we're all broadening our discussion with you on many subjects now, and get back to what Father Larson was talking about. I heard you in a dialogue earlier discuss this, and I wish you would take a minute to distinguish between two concepts in the field of ethics for us, and then when you do that, then I have a follow-up question. That is, concerning your writings in situation ethics, if I am correct, understand that there's two major schools of thought, one being a very, very historical one, that there are certain absolutes that one can know about and one is taught that are always right or wrong, such as questions of murder, question of adultery, and on down the list. And that one never violates those particular ethics. And the other school of thought is the situation ethics. Would you first elaborate upon those two schools of thought for us, please?
Yeah. A minority of Christians in the classical tradition would have agreed with me about situation ethics. That is to say that the right thing to do is always the most loving thing you can do. And that has to be determined according to the specific variables of a concrete and particular situation, that you can't generalize or universalize the norms of human behavior. But the majority of Christians in the great tradition have taken the other position, that there are certain norms or rules of conduct which are universally valid and absolutely obliging to be followed. Now, I'll give you an example. One of the 10 Commandments has to do with killing. The prohibition of killing, if it were absolutized and universalized, would mean pacifism. Now, I, as a situationist, just can't imagine any responsible person being a pacifist in the sense of saying absolutely that regardless of the circumstances, every act of war is as such wrong. To me, it would depend on the case. I would be quite prepared to see that in the vast majority of cases, wars were not really justifiable. But that's a very different thing from saying that all war is as such unjustifiable. So I would say, with respect to adultery, theft, truth-telling, you name it. Another way of putting it is not in terms of the difference between absolute and relative rules of behavior. Another way to do it would be to say, should we determine what is the right thing to do when we're faced with a problem of conscience by determining what the rule says and then following it? Or should one say, ask the question, what will be the consequences of this, that, or the other course of action open to you alternatively, and then choose the course of action in that situation which promises the most benefit. One is a consequential approach, mine. The other is a principled approach, Paul Ramsey's, for example. Now, people of that classical school would say that there are some things which we ought never to do, no matter how good the consequences are. And in my way of looking at it, to say that is to be irresponsible.
My second question, then, you've done a very eloquent job of distinguishing between the two, would be that, let us suppose hypothetically that the world would adopt the situation ethics, that became the ethics for all mankind, and there were no absolutes, then who would decide what decisions would be from day to day? Would it be on an individual basis, or would there still be some kind of structure and institutions that would have the decision-making process? What I'm saying is, who would adopt the rules? What rules will we play the game by?
Well, I would say that in the social order, knowing what we do about human beings and how utterly selfish some people can be sometimes, it is obviously necessary that there must be some rules of the game. Now, sensible, ethically sensible men who make laws saying how far you can go in this, that, or the other respect would say when they did it. Now, we know that these are not absolutely valid, inherently and intrinsically valid rules, but on the whole, they represent the greatest good of the greatest number. And it's better that we should have these rules than that we should have none. And I would be inclined to buy that. Although even so, I would, as a conscientious man, want to reserve to myself the right, when the crunch between the law and justice is too great, to engage in acts of civil disobedience, taking the consequences that society might impose upon me for the exercise of my freedom as a conscientious man. But I think my answer is, of the two alternatives you suggest, that a sane society must have some rules of the game that we all obey for the sake of the common order, although if obeying it is too much against one's conscience, then he might decide to disobey but take the consequences.
Thank you. Father Lars.
Convocation week dealt with the whole question of values. Early in the week, we had a professional athlete, or a person who had been, and he was talking about how competition is an integral part of our way of life, and was discussing how competitive athletics, team sports, and things that involved intense competition were healthy because they enabled a person to function better in our society, to be more competitive, to survive in a competitive situation. Whereas a lot of people I talk with today are raising a question about that value. They're saying they find that it's not necessarily healthy. They find it destructive, at least some types of competition. And yet we are in that kind of situation. Now, my question to you is, what is your own particular feeling about the health or the destructiveness of competition as a way of life? And then, following upon that, how should we proceed to respond to what the present situation is?
Well, I guess an off-the-cuff answer would be that I, as an individual, would distrust radical competition in the sense of the jungle ethics of 19th century American capitalism before our society put some rules and regulations on competition. Just as I would at the other end of the spectrum be opposed to and uncomfortable in a radically cooperative society like the socialist society in the Soviet Union. Somewhere in between these two, it seems to me, there's a kind of healthy, creative middle ground with the virtues and values of competition on the one hand and the virtues and values of cooperation on the other.
What are the values of competition that you would see?
Oh, I think that, for example, I'm thinking of medicine, with which I'm closest these days. In medical education, if we didn't have some competition, we would never really know which of the people who were preparing for specialties in medical care had developed the greatest skill and competence. The motive for competition might be just to get better at whatever it is you're doing or playing, and the motive, of course, for the competition might be, to me, an unacceptable motive, namely of just sheer winning at any cost and getting ahead regardless of the quality of your performance. And it's insofar as competition contributes to growth and development and skill and ability, it is a good thing. Insofar as competition is just what we sometimes call cutthroat, or sheerly financially motivated, I think it's a bad thing. As you know, being a situationist, I find it very hard to impose generalized judgments on anything. Yes.
Mr. Snyder.
Dr. Fletcher, today we've talked about many topics, of course, touching on abortion and various forms of artificial insemination and other ethical questions. And I have heard you state elsewhere that human needs validate human rights. And it seems to me that somewhere in what we've been talking about today, the area of human rights comes up. I wonder if you would elaborate on the statement, human needs.
Well, if you like, we've been talking now, for example, you asked earlier a question comparing Italy's policy and the Scandinavian policy with regard to the alleged right to reproduce. Now, so-called rights are simply a recognition legally by society that people have certain needs which they should be free to satisfy. And what makes a so-called right is that it meets an authentic need. Very often people will appeal to human rights not to satisfy a human need, but to repudiate or reject a human need. For example, when people assert that they have a right to reproduce without any control or limitation or let or hindrance, what they are saying in effect is that they are free to ignore the need of a child that they might conceive and bring into this world to have a fair chance in terms of health and ability and survivability. Now, this kind of question then poses for us what you've already hinted at, namely, is it the need that is more fundamental, which validates the right or claim, or is it having the right or the claim that determines whether the need is to be respected or not? And from the nature of my response to your question, you can see that I'm firmly convinced that needs have priority over rights, or to use the language of Christian ethics, all rights are at best only imperfect.
Mr. Salem.
Dr. Fletcher, in the 1950s, there was what's supposed to be a great religious revival in this country that has rapidly deteriorated to a religious revolution. Isn't what you're saying basically that the failure on traditional religions to recognize human needs as opposed to rules and regulations, part of the reason that less traditional sects of religions have developed and are becoming more and more popular all the time, especially among younger people?
I'm not sure I know how to answer your question. I can only say that it is my impression, this may be agreeing or disagreeing, I don't know. I have the impression that there are more people in the historic bodies of the Reformation and of the Catholic Church who would be sympathetic with these new modes of reproduction than we would find in the new sects. But to answer that question, of course, brings us right down to what sects, S-E-C-T-S's, are you talking about? And maybe what I think of when you speak of new sects and what you think of are different things.
Well, I was thinking basically of, in the Los Angeles area, the development of what they call Jesus freaks. The black Americans, sudden development in the area of, Muhammad Ali's belief is, follows Elijah Muhammad, I believe it is. There's a great development in this area among black Americans who I feel are saying basically that the churches are more involved with, as you said, historic beliefs than not just in the area of reproduction, but in the needs of people, civil needs as well as.
Oh yes, yes. I understand your question better now. Appreciate it better. Yes, I think there's no doubt about it that many of these emerging sects are in rebellion against the more historic bodies because they feel, with some reason maybe, that they've become very respectable and uninventive and uninnovated and inelastic and too damn respectable. That's right. Yeah.
Dr. Fletcher, I would like to bring up a subject that was in the news media some time ago, and that is from one of the leaders in the religious community in this country who's very well known, I understand, charged you and others who are the situation ethics of preaching a particular theology or philosophy in this country that has taken hold of the point that it's resulting in a deterioration of certain values and ethics and produces such things as Watergate. How would you respond to such charges, or how would you defend situation ethics against?
Well, Billy Graham has been saying that I was the architect of the Watergate for a long time, but that's kind of a wild remark. More recently, in this week's Time, last week I guess now, Time magazine, there was a report that they had a meeting of theologians in Hartford, which found that certain people, and they named me and Harvey Cox and Bishop Robinson as the main ones, had developed heretical or semi-heretical ideas that have tended to undermine the vigor and sturdiness and faithfulness of the Christian faith or something. These people are always worried about growth. You know, they have the faith once for all delivered to the saints. Well, boy, when you get a package like that, you don't want anybody tinkering with the wrapping on it, you know. But that doesn't trouble me very much. That kind of discussion is not really very analytical anyway. It's more epiphytic. That is to say, it's more name-calling activity or a charge-making activity than it is investigative or...
I would like to pursue another question with you, and we are running short of time, and I apologize to the panel for taking their time, but a former student of yours, the late Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., dealt with civil disobedience, and you referred to that a minute ago, and he was very concerned about just and unjust laws in our own society, indicating that one obeys just laws and has a ethical or moral obligation to disobey unjust laws. Would you react to or comment on his position, and also while doing that, distinguish for us the difference between civil disobedience and revolution?
Well, now, that's quite a package. An interesting one. I think King, all along, since he was at the Crozier Seminary as an undergraduate student of theology in Chester in Philadelphia, was a pacifist. And he absolutized at least one moral rule, namely, you never use force and violence. And I couldn't buy that because I'm no pacifist. I wouldn't absolutize any moral rule. But on the other hand, he was very clear that there are other ways of bringing compulsion upon people morally. For example, by the moral jiu-jitsu of taking a beating for disobeying the law. And he was an exponent of civil disobedience. He didn't say that we should disobey all unjust laws, but those where, you know, it seemed that the injustice that follows from obeying them is intolerable. Then he would do it. And certainly he felt, and I agreed with him, that his people were an example of grossly unjust law. He did not, however, believe in revolution. And the difference, I think, comes down to something like this, that by definition, an act of civil disobedience is one where you decide to disobey the law for conscience sake. You believe that there's too much gap between the terms of the law, the statute on the one hand, and the requirements of justice on the other, fair play. You do this, however, openly, not in a secret fashion. And you do it prepared to take the consequences of your disobedience. This is the way you acknowledge that there is a necessity for law and order. And your protest is against a law or cluster of laws, the effect of which you think is intolerably unjust. But the true revolutionary is a very different kettle of fish. The revolutionary is somebody who has decided, conscientiously we may assume, not just that some laws are unjust, but that the state itself is unjust, the whole system. And presumably, if you are conscientiously a revolutionary, you're just forced by necessity into an illegal existence, and you do go underground, and you do your illegalities clandestinely and secretly rather than openly and defiantly, until you figure that you can get away with rebellion. And Martin King was not a revolutionary. He was a believer in the practice of civil disobedience within the democratic framework.
Thank you. Father Larson.
Another informational question has already been indicated. Medical science has produced numerous very complex ethical issues in the area of human reproduction, euthanasia, abortion, the whole field of what we can do in terms of reproducing different parts of the body. Obviously, physicians are a part of this whole process now, whether they like it or not, of helping people to struggle with deeply ethical issues. My question to you, being very much involved with medical schools today, is what is being done to really enable physicians to assume their ethical obligations?
10 seconds, I'm sorry.
In 10 seconds, well, there's a most unsatisfactory but very palpable increase in the amount of education and training in moral decision-making going on in medical education these days, perforce, because, as you say, physicians are not unlike everybody else. They're concerned about these things.
Dr. Fletcher, I had to bring our program to conclusion. On behalf of the panel, I am only sorry we don't have another 1 hour to pursue these questions with you. And panel, thank you for your questions. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us this evening, and our guest has been the theologian, Dr. Joseph Fletcher. Thank you, and join us next week.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. The preceding student production was brought to you by videotape recording.